For decades, historians said it was gone. The Navy closed the file. The families stopped asking. The world simply moved on. But somewhere, in the black, freezing silence of the deep ocean, something was waiting. 3,000 feet below the surface, where no light reaches, where no sound travels. It had been sitting there, completely untouched, for over 80 years. And when the cameras finally descended into that darkness, what they found changed everything. Welcome everyone to DeepWave Discovery, the channel where the ocean gives up its secrets, one story at a time. Now listen, if you are new here, and maybe you have been around long enough to remember when television had only 3 channels, then do us one small favor. Find that little red subscribe button. If you don't need glasses for it, it's big, it's red, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Just one gentle click, and you'll never miss a story like this again. Consider it your daily dose of the most extraordinary history the world almost forgot. And before we dive in, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Whether you're in a warm living room in Texas, sipping tea somewhere in England, or watching from a little village halfway across the world, we want to know. This community stretches across every ocean, and that is something truly special. The year was 1944. The Second World War was burning across every corner of the planet. Oceans were not just water anymore. They were battlegrounds. And in those dark waters, powerful warships moved like steel ghosts, carrying thousands of young men into the most dangerous missions imaginable. One of those ships was considered among the finest vessels its navy had ever built. It was fast. It was armed. It was feared by the enemy. The crew aboard it were proud soldiers, many of them barely 20 years old, who believed they were serving something larger than themselves. Then one day, the ship simply disappeared. No distress signal, no confirmed wreckage, no survivors washing ashore with stories to tell. The vessel was there one moment, and then the sea swallowed it whole. In the weeks that followed, military officials launched a brief search. They found nothing. The ocean, as it so often does, had kept its secret perfectly. After a short investigation, the Navy made an official decision. The ship was lost. All hands were presumed dead. The file was quietly closed. But here is where the story becomes something stranger than most people realize. For years, and then for decades, the question of what exactly happened to that warship refused to die completely. Historians noticed small inconsistencies in the official reports, dates that did not match, coordinates that seemed slightly off, witness accounts from nearby vessels that described sounds and sightings that were never fully explained. Families of the crew kept asking questions that nobody in authority seemed willing to answer directly. They were told, politely but firmly, that nothing more was known, that the sea had taken the ship, and the sea does not give back what it takes. Most of the world accepted this explanation. After all, war is chaos. Ships sink, men die. Records get lost or damaged or deliberately buried under mountains of bureaucracy. It was a painful truth, but it was the only truth available. So the warship passed into the gray area between history and legend. Some people believed it had been sunk by enemy fire in a classified operation that the government never wanted to fully acknowledge. Others suggested the ship had suffered an internal disaster, an accident too embarrassing for the Navy to admit publicly. A small, stubborn group of researchers believed something else entirely. They believed the ship was still down there, perfectly preserved, waiting, and for 80 years. Nobody had the technology or the courage to go deep enough to find out if they were right. There is a particular kind of person in this world, not the kind who accepts silence as an answer, not the kind who looks at a closed file and thinks, yes, that must be the end of it. No. There is a different kind of person entirely, the kind who looks at that same closed file, feels something tighten in their chest, a quiet, burning refusal. A voice somewhere deep inside that whispers somebody is not telling the whole truth. These were the people who kept the warship story alive. They were not always professionals. They were not always funded by universities or governments or powerful institutions. Many of them were simply passionate individuals, retired naval historians working from cluttered home offices, amateur researchers spending their own savings, a few dedicated divers who had made it their personal mission to solve the mystery that official history had abandoned. For years, they shared notes. They exchanged letters. They argued over maps spread across kitchen tables late into the night. Every small detail mattered. A report from a merchant vessel that claimed to have seen a large explosion on the horizon. A radiolog entry that was mysteriously crossed out and never explained. A set of coordinates in a declassified document that pointed to a region of the ocean nobody had ever properly searched. Each clue was a small candle in a very large darkness. And then came the technology that changed everything. By the early 2000s, deep-sea exploration had entered a new era entirely. Remotely operated vehicles, known simply as ROVs, had become sophisticated enough to descend to depths that were once considered completely unreachable. Sonar mapping systems could now scan vast areas of the ocean floor with extraordinary precision, creating detailed images of the bottom from the surface above. Suddenly, 3,000 feet did not feel quite so impossible anymore. A small but serious expedition team began to form. They came from different backgrounds: marine archaeologists, naval historians, deep-sea technology specialists, and a few experienced wreck divers who had located other famous lost vessels in previous years. What united them was not funding, because the funding was always difficult, but a shared, almost stubborn conviction that the ship was real, that it was down there, and that the families of the crew deserved better than silence. They studied every available document. They cross-referenced weather reports from the period of the disappearance with ocean current data. They built a probability map, a targeted search zone, roughly 40 nautical miles wide, based on everything the evidence quietly suggested, but never openly stated. Previous expeditions had searched nearby. 2 separate attempts in the 1980s had found nothing and returned empty-handed. The media had briefly covered both failures with a kind of polite indifference, and the story had faded again each time. This team decided to approach the search differently. Instead of rushing toward the most obvious coordinates, they began at the edges, the places other searchers had ignored because they seemed slightly too far, slightly too deep, slightly too inconvenient. They believed the ship had drifted further than anyone had previously calculated before it finally sank below the surface. They prepared their equipment. They secured a research vessel. They chose a window of weather calm enough to operate safely. And then they went to sea. The ocean, as always, did not make it easy. 3 days into the expedition, rough weather forced them to pause operations completely. Equipment malfunctioned twice. One critical sonar scan had to be restarted from the beginning after a data error wiped nearly 6 hours of results. But on the 5th day, a shape appeared on the sonar screen. Long, angular, unmistakably man-made, sitting perfectly still, at 3,000 feet below. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the team leader looked at the screen, looked at his colleagues, and said 3 words very quietly. "That's our ship." Silence has a different quality underwater. On the surface, silence is simply the absence of noise. A quiet room, a still night, something that can be broken at any moment by the smallest sound. But at 3,000 feet below the ocean surface, silence is something else entirely. It is heavy, it is absolute. It is the kind of silence that has not been disturbed for decades, the kind that settles into every crack and corner of a place and makes it feel almost sacred. Like a cathedral that nobody has entered in 80 years, like a room where time itself decided to stop and simply wait. This was the silence the ROV descended into on that cold, gray morning. The team aboard the research vessel watched their monitors with the kind of stillness that only genuine, almost unbearable anticipation can produce. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody checked their phone. Every single person in that room was completely, utterly focused on the small camera feed descending slowly into the black. 10 feet, then 50, then 200. The light from the ROV pushed outward in a pale blue cone, illuminating perhaps 15 feet of water in every direction before the darkness simply swallowed it whole. Below that small circle of light, nothing. An infinite, impenetrable blackness that pressed against the camera like something almost alive. 500 feet. Then 1,000. The water temperature on the external sensors dropped steadily. The pressure readings climbed. The team leader stood with his arms folded, watching the depths counter on the screen with the focused expression of a man who'd spent 15 years preparing for exactly this moment and was now almost afraid to breathe. At 2,600 feet, something changed. The sonar began registering a solid mass directly below. The ROV's external lights caught the first faint suggestion of a shape in the darkness. Not color, not detail, just a vague, enormous outline emerging slowly from the black water like a memory surfacing from deep in the mind. And then, at 3,000 feet, the warship appeared. What the camera showed in those first seconds was not the dramatic wreckage that most people imagine when they think of a sunken vessel. There was no twisted, broken chaos. No scattered debris fields stretching across the ocean floor in every direction. Instead, the ship was whole. Extraordinarily, almost impossibly whole. She sat upright on the ocean floor at a slight angle, perhaps 15 degrees to one side, as though she had simply chosen to rest there. Her hull, though encrusted with 80 years of marine growth, was fundamentally intact. Her superstructure rose from the deck in recognizable shapes. Gun turrets still pointed outward. Railings still stood along the sides of the deck. A ladder, an ordinary simple ladder welded to the side of the bridge, was still exactly where some long-dead engineer had placed it. The team aboard the surface vessel went completely silent. One researcher later described the moment as feeling like accidentally walking into someone's home and realizing the family had only just left. Except the family had been gone since 1944. The ROV moved slowly along the length of the ship, its cameras capturing everything with meticulous care. And as it moved, the evidence of the ship's final moments began to reveal itself in quiet, devastating detail. On the port side, near the rear of the vessel, there was a catastrophic rupture in the hull. The metal around it was bent outward, not inward, which told the team something immediately and with absolute certainty. The explosion had come from inside the ship. Not an enemy torpedo, not a mine. Something internal had detonated with enough force to compromise the vessel's structural integrity below the waterline. The ship had not been shot out of the ocean. She had been destroyed from within, and the Navy had known this, or strongly suspected it, from the very beginning, which explained with sudden and terrible clarity exactly why the file had been closed so quickly. Exactly why the coordinates in the official reports had been slightly but deliberately wrong. Exactly why 80 years of questions had been met with 80 years of silence. This was not simply a shipwreck. This was a secret. And 3,000 feet below the surface, it had been perfectly, patiently preserved, waiting for exactly this moment. There is a moment in every great discovery when the excitement of finding something transforms into the weight of understanding what was actually lost. That moment came quietly for this team, not during the descent, not during the first breathless seconds when the warship emerged from the darkness. It came later, when the researchers sat together in the small, dimly lit cabin of the research vessel, reviewing the footage frame by frame, and began to see not just a ship, but the lives that had been lived aboard it. A coffee mug, still sitting on a shelf in what remained of the galley, held in place for 80 years by the same metal bracket some young sailor had fastened it to before his last shift. A pair of boots near a doorway positioned with the quiet, a conscious habit of someone who expected to return and put them on again. A photograph pressed flat against a surface by the slow, patient pressure of deep water. Its image long dissolved, but its frame still there, still holding the ghost of whoever had been important enough to bring to war. These were not artifacts. They were people. And for the first time in 8 decades, the world was being asked to remember them properly. The discovery immediately ignited a serious and necessary conversation among naval historians, government officials, and the families of the crew. Because what the wreck had revealed, that internal explosion, that deliberately misplaced coordinates, those quietly closed files pointed toward a truth that certain institutions had spent 80 years carefully avoiding. The ship had not been lost in glorious combat. It had been destroyed by a catastrophic internal failure. Most likely an ammunition handling accident of the kind that was tragically common during that period of the war, but deeply embarrassing for a Navy that was simultaneously asking the public to trust its competence and sacrifice their sons to its command. The cover was not malicious in the dramatic sense. It was bureaucratic, institutional, the quiet, cowardly kind of dishonesty that does not require a single villain, only a system of people who find it easier to close a file than to face a grieving family and say the words, "We made a mistake, and your son paid for it." For the families who had survived into old age still carrying that silence, the discovery broke something open. Several descendants of the crew gave interviews in the weeks following the announcement of the find. An elderly woman in her late 80s, the daughter of one of the ship's engineers, sat in front of a camera and spoke with the particular, devastating composure of someone who has spent a lifetime learning how to hold grief very still. She said she had always known, somehow, that her father's ship was still down there. She said her mother had refused to accept the Navy's conclusion until the day she died. And she said something that no official statement, no press release, no carefully worded government acknowledgement could ever quite match in its simple, quiet power. He deserved to be found, she said. They all did. The wreck itself, the international maritime archaeological community agreed almost immediately, must be protected. At 3,000 feet, it is beyond the reach of amateur salvage operations, which offers it a natural protection that shallower wrecks rarely enjoy. Proposals were formally submitted to designate the site as an official war grave, a protected memorial under international maritime law, where the ship and everything within it would remain permanently undisturbed. Because that, ultimately, is what this discovery truly represents. Not a triumph of technology. Not a victory for the researchers who spent years refusing to accept silence. Not even a correction of the historical record. Though it is certainly all of these things, it is, most essentially, an act of witness. The ocean kept this ship for 80 years, to preserve the coffee mug and the boots and the empty photograph frame with a faithfulness that no human institution had managed to match. And when the cameras finally descended and the lights finally reached into that absolute darkness, the ship was ready to be seen. The men who never came home were ready to be acknowledged. History, when it is honest, does not always arrive on time, but sometimes, in the cold, silent, patient depths of the sea, it waits.